final reform movement we're going to take a look at during this time frame is the movement to end slavery. And it's definitely the most divisive issue of our reform movements. So we're going to look at the political issues surrounding the elimination of slavery, emancipation of slaves. We're going to address different techniques that were utilized, as well as the stories of those who worked tirelessly to make it happen. Now, going all the way back to the Articles of Confederation in 1787, the Northwest Ordinance included a provision that would forever ban slavery in all states that came about from this territory. Since this land was north of the Ohio River and east of the Mississippi River, it helps explain why the Ohio River became this de facto symbol of freedom that separated the free North from the enslaved South. Now, the Constitution famously didn't ban or even mention slavery, as the Three-Fifths Compromise really was as close as it got. The Constitution did mention that 1808 was the first year Congress was allowed to repeal the transatlantic slave trade, and they did so on January 1st of that year. However, we see that the domestic trade continues, meaning the importation of potential African slaves is illegal, but they're still traded between state lines. Now, in 1790, a petition reached Congress from a Pennsylvania group that wanted an immediate end to slavery, and this petition was signed by the president of that organization, a man named Benjamin Franklin. However, a formal gag rule was introduced in the House that barred any measure on slavery from being taken up in the House. Now, abolitionists were already banned from mass mailing Southern addresses. So this is an attempt by Southern politicians to keep their views from enjoying a full debate in the House. A similar measure was debated between Clay and Calhoun in the Senate, and while no formal gag rule was issued, anytime an abolitionist petition was introduced by a senator, another person would immediately motion to table the petition, and tabling it was not debatable, so the petition would get buried. This happens from about the mid-1830s to 1850s, so about 15 years, although the elder statesman on your screen, John Quincy Adams, does try to get around it in numerous ways, earning him the respect of abolitionists across the nation. Now, prior to the debate over the so-called gag rule, the issue with slavery, at least politically, also extends to questions on what to do with freed slaves. So in 1819, a Virginia congressman got the Monroe administration to help subsidize, meaning help pay for, what became known as the ACS, or the American Colonization Society. Now, this society wants to follow the example of a British businessman who set up the colony of Sierra Leone. You can see it on your screen here. The British set up Sierra Leone to give freed black English a place to migrate to. And in some cases, these individuals were freed during the American Revolution. The U.S. Navy actually helped the society purchase land on the west coast of Africa that became known as Liberia. And over 15,000 former slaves would migrate there prior to the Civil War. Now, disease actually killed many settlers, and it detracted potential immigrants. So colonization of Africa isn't viewed as long-term. All right, and Monrovia is the capital of Liberia, and to this day, it remains the only foreign nation who has a capital named after an American president. So this is the political side of things. In terms of how to end slavery, we have three main methods, and realistically, the one that kind of takes the middle of the road is gradualism, or gradual emancipation. The idea is that slavery should be phased out over time, and that owners should be compensated for the freed slaves, because slaves were considered property. Gradualism had been instituted in some northern states, most notably New York, and many founding fathers had felt that this would be the best path. Abolition was considered highly radical because it was an immediate end to slavery. All slaves go free, owners not compensated. Anti-slavery pamphlets were mailed out en masse, very similar to how religious reformers mailed out Bibles and sermons. So this is what prompted that ban on mass mailings of abolitionist literature in the South. It got so bad that the mayor of Charleston, South Carolina, burned a massive bonfire of these tracts. And the response really shocked the daughter of Lyman Beecher, Harriet Beecher Stowe. The actual numbers of abolitionists weren't all that large, but they're very vocal, and they really pressed the issue. Violence was also another potential solution, albeit quite deadly, not one that many people advocated for. The prime example is that of Nat Turner. Now, Nat Turner was a field hand by day, but he spent his nights preaching and prophesying to the local slave community. He had been taught to read and write, and that was unusual for a slave. And he was allowed to freely travel to preach the gospel to slaves in Southampton County, Virginia. Now, as a religious man, Turner claimed that he had spoken to the prophets. And a rare solar eclipse that he saw in winter of 1831 was the signal that the new revolution, a slave revolt, should begin. So late in the night of August 21st, which was the 40th anniversary of the Haitian Revolution, Nat Turner unbolted the door of his master's house, and 6 other slaves came in and killed every member of the family. And Nat Turner wasn't necessarily involved in the killings himself. He often arrived in the aftermath of what happened, as his band made their march to the county seat of Jerusalem. 57 white Virginians were killed over a 2-day period, 46 of them women and children. And Turner stated for his followers to remember that ours is not a war for robbery or to satisfy our passions. It is a struggle for freedom. Now, the uprising was put down by multiple forces, and Turner himself was captured on October 30th. He was tried November 5th and hanged 6 days later. And some Virginians warned that future rebellions would take place, so gradual emancipation should occur, while others simply wanted to crack down on existing slave behaviors. It was the western portions unaffected by slavery, western portions of Virginia that wanted gradual emancipation, and in 1863, these western counties broke away from Virginia and became known as West Virginia. So we've got the political side of things. We have different techniques to end slavery. When we look at the people who made it happen, who worked tirelessly, we start with Sojourner Truth. Now, she was born in New York State when they still allowed slavery, and her name was Isabella. She had a very rough upbringing, which is, to put it mildly, her first owners were Dutch, and she didn't understand English when she was sold to English masters, so that led to some confrontation. In 1827, all slaves in New York were officially emancipated, and New York had those gradual laws. But her 5-year-old son was sold to new masters in Alabama shortly before the emancipation took effect, and this was a violation of New York law. Newly freed, she sued, and she won her son's return. So that custody rights case that we took a look at with women's rights, that was her. She also left her husband upon emancipation and became a very fiery traveling Methodist preacher. At 5'11" and with a powerful voice, she commanded the room and took the name Sojourner Truth, advocating for abolition for the rest of her life. The Underground Railroad was a network of safe houses that harbored fugitive slaves on their way to freedom. Now, the safe houses were mostly operated by free black Americans, but there were some white abolitionists who did participate. And a major reason that Southerners were so opposed to slavery being outlawed in D.C. was that they felt like it would become a major stopping point on this network, even though D.C. kind of secretly became a stopping point anyways. Northern cities would remain relatively safe until the 1850s, and that's when the woman on your screen becomes the most famous conductor on the Underground Railroad. Harriet Tubman is a woman who was an escapee herself. She's 6'2", so she's physically imposing. And she would later serve as a spy for the Union Army. In serving for the Union Army, making countless trips to the South to lead slaves to freedom, she definitely took her life into her own hands and is certainly exemplary of the courage that was required for this undertaking. So we have Sojourner Truth, we have Harriet Tubman. In 1831, William Lloyd Garrison published the first edition of The Liberator, and this is a weekly newspaper that was bankrolled by the same men who helped finance the revivals of Charles Grandison Finney. His mission was to promote an end to slavery, and shortly afterwards, he helped found the American Anti-Slavery Society, and their chapters would boast about 250,000 members by 1838. Garrison vehemently disagreed with the colonization movement, and he compared it to the Indian Removal Act. So this kind of discredits it in the eyes of many Northerners. He used logic in arguing that slavery contradicted the words of the Bible and the Constitution itself. However, as an extreme pacifist, he drew a firm line on using violent means to achieve abolition, so he would have disagreed with Nat Turner's actions. Oddly enough, Garrison had a bounty placed on his head by the Georgia legislature, who would pay $5,000 to anyone willing to take him south. And finally, we arrive at a man who was born Frederick Bailey. Frederick Bailey was born a slave in Maryland. He was taught to read and write from the Bible by the wife of his master, and his master put a stop to it and said that if he learned to read, it would forever unfit him to be a slave. And this idea really stuck with Douglass. So he paid neighbor boys to teach him to read, and he would practice with discarded newspapers. This really opened his eyes to the greater world of abolition. At age 20, he escaped north and he renames himself Frederick Douglass to prevent recapture. Now, he began to give speeches, and he caught the attention of the abolitionist movement that was spearheaded by Garrison. He was so eloquent that some questioned the authenticity of his accounts, questioned whether he was really a former slave. He published a 125-page autobiography in 1845, and the 50-cent book sold about 30,000 copies. He even went on a 2-year lecture tour of the British Isles, where recapture was unlikely. He was getting so popular that it was feared that his master would figure out who he was. Douglass's method of advocating for increased rights was to tirelessly work the lecture circuit, and while in Britain, his friends even raised the equivalent of $1,250 to buy his freedom from his former owners so he could return to the States safely and continue his work. So we've got the political side of things, we have the different methodologies to try and end slavery, and we have the tales of the people themselves, those who, using various means, would work exceptionally hard to end this system.